Hi, and welcome back to The Beat. Today I'm sitting here with Eric Nichols, the Department Chair for Communications here at Worcester State. So Eric, can you tell me a little bit about your background and your history with Worcester State?
Well, right now I'm the Communication Department Chair. I started at Worcester State in the fall of 2000. So I got here as a freshman, and then I did my undergrad over the course of 6 years. So it took me 6 years to finish my degree here. In that time, I started working in the photo lab as a lab technician for the department. When I finished my degree in communications, I went out and I started being a photographer. And then in 2008, the photo lab manager at the time left, and then I took over as photo lab manager and during that time, I also started teaching as an adjunct faculty member. And then throughout the next decade or so, I was teaching as an adjunct, running the lab, and then I became a tenure-track professor in 2019. And then this year I took over as department chair.
What made you want to come back to teach at Worcester State? Was it the role itself, or was it something about just the school as a whole?
It probably was more about the teaching itself, combined with the fact that, so when I was an undergrad, I did my courses, I was a student here, but I did a lot of my courses at Clark University through the consortium. And so the nice thing about that was I got a feel for being both a state college student and being in a private school. And so even at that point, I had noticed there's just a very different feel between being, what it was like to be somebody from a state school who was working full time and, had a lot of other obligations versus the bulk of the students at the private school who were, their tuitions were covered, they didn't have to work full time. There's just a different mentality to that. And I remember at the time feeling like, okay, so, being at this fancy private school versus like a state school, and the state school, had a kind of connotation to it, like, okay, it's just Worcester State. But I realized really quickly that it was like the difference in students wasn't like, there was nothing about how smart people were, there was nothing about the quality of education. It was just a matter of haves and have-nots. And so I realized really quickly, when I graduated, I was still actually working here part-time in the photo lab. And when they asked me to teach, I kind of realized I think I do want to teach at a state school because it kind of felt more of a kinship to that, because I knew what it was like to work full-time, and it was just a different feeling, it was a different expectation. And then from there, I just kind of just stayed.
How have you seen the program change and evolve over the years, both in terms of what's being taught and the students?
That's a big question. Let's break that down into parts. So let's talk about first how the program's changed.
Yeah.
So when I first got here, there was no digital photography courses. I'm trying to remember, I think we got our first computer lab for the department right around the time I got here. It was also before any video professors were hired. So while we had an introduction to video and we had TV production, the course was taught by faculty with PhDs who were not production-based faculty. So everybody most of the faculty did a little bit of everything. And at the time, there were no faculty with MFAs, right? So nobody had a master's in fine arts. Everybody had a PhD. After my first year or so, the university hired Suzanne Gaynor to teach photography, and she was the first faculty member to have an MFA. So she was the first non-PhD professor with a terminal degree. And her sole focus was production. And then after that, they hired Julian Berrien, who also had an MFA, to teach TV production and video. So and now today we're up to 4 MFA faculty, so 4 people who are solely based in production. And the department's now even. And so since I've been here, we've seen a lot of growth in the production side of the program. Technology obviously has changed a lot. So when I first got here, there was no digital photography courses. We had to, I was in the first round as they were developing courses. And it was kind of an interesting time where students were learning Photoshop at the same time faculty were learning Photoshop. Students were learning editing software while faculty were learning editing software. So that was kind of that shifting point. And so there's a lot of experimentation and growth happening all over the place, which was really interesting. And so we also have seen a big shift in the types of equipment we offer. So we had no digital cameras. We had, everything was on tape, right? And so mini DV tapes. We had maybe 5 cameras total for video cameras for students to borrow at that point. And now we're up to we're quickly growing to way over 20 per area for cameras. So things have shifted a lot. We had no scanners. We had no inkjet printers. It was really just the beginning of the digital program as a whole. So just watching that stuff grow and being a huge part of bringing in more and more equipment and offering more courses in production has been really exciting. Student changes, it's weird. They're the same, but they're different. Overall, the general student still wants the same thing. They still need the same stuff in terms of students are still working a lot. Students are still trying to figure out how to make it all work together. There's always that sort of battle between, I've got a combination of this much, a certain amount of, everybody has a certain amount of energy. And then what I find with Worcester State students is we always get confused, and I'm going to include myself in this as a student. We always get confused between, how much effort should I put into my job that I need so I can pay to go to school and eat and drive my car, and right? And how much energy should I put into my education? And you're never going to it's never going to be perfect, right? At some point you run out of energy and you just say, I'm too tired to do, and you're not going to be perfect at any of it. And that was that big difference I saw between private schools and state schools most of the time when I was a student was, the state school students, we all kind of had this feeling of yeah, that'd be great if I had more time to work on that, but I don't. So I have to kind of limit how much I can get done. And so sometimes that expectation drops. So that hasn't changed. I think what's changed is cost kind of is a huge difference. So for me, it was $3,000 a year to go to Worcester State. And even then that felt like a lot sometimes because I had to figure out how to spend that money. It's how do I earn enough money and do all those things? It was certainly easier. I think now it's you guys have to work more, right? So that demand on time and energy is more, right? Because now you're trying to divide the pie up into even more work and then trying to struggle to finish school. The other part of that is the technology shift. I've at least, and not to sound the old curmudgeon, but I've noticed that students don't take notes anymore. For instance, it's having students in class and not having to say, guys, write this down. That kind of thing. It used to be that's one of the biggest things is that shift in technology has sort of made it harder for students to feel the need to take notes or everything's always at our fingertips, right? Google. Not we didn't have Google and at the time Yahoo, and it's not that we didn't look it up, but it wasn't in our palm. And so there's this sort of swap, and I would say this is the biggest difference because everything else is kind of not really that big of a deal. The biggest swap is the instant access has made it so we don't, and this is true of me too, I'm guilty of this, I don't have to memorize much. But then where the downside of that is there's a difference between having information and having knowledge. And I think where students are starting to, where it feels different is students have instant access to information, but maybe aren't aware as much of that. Actually, I'm thinking about this and I don't think I knew the difference between information and memorization and knowledge at that point either. But the ability to recall something when you don't have access to your phone. If you're on the fly shooting, you can't say, oh, let me stop and look that up, right? You have to just know it. Or if you're in the middle of working on something, you have to just know what to do. And if you don't bother to ever really invest in learning the thought process behind those things, then you find yourself at a disadvantage. And that'd be the biggest shift, is just getting students to a point where they're like, have those critical thinking skills of like working through problems versus just being like, I'll look that up, like I'll watch a tutorial. So I think that's a big thing too.
So with communications, I found that there was a lot of opportunity to apply those skills that you learned in the classroom to real world situations. Do you think how important do you think that is for students?
Oh, that's everything. I think the biggest problem is that so it goes back to what I was saying, like, because most classes, and I'm a big fan of theory courses, like I teach visual media literacy, and like I love the theory side of photography and art and communication in general, but there's a vast difference between learning that stuff and then understanding why you're learning it, right? So sometimes it feels like, okay, I'm learning theory, but why do I really need this theory? Until you find yourself in a real world situation where all of a sudden that theory starts coming into play of why you're making decisions. And one of the great things about being in a program that's very experiential, right? Like communication is a very experiential program, is that you have to put that into play. And if you're like me, like I was never the kind of student who like just would read a book, like not that I didn't read books, but like, and then would immediately understand why I was reading that book. I kind of would go, I don't know why I'm reading this. Like, I don't know if this is important, you know? And I would read it and I would do the work, but I didn't always know why. You know, I didn't really understand it until I was out in the field shooting photos and, you know, working on video projects. And all of a sudden I'd go, oh, okay, it makes sense now. And so in the communication department, the nice thing is there's a lot of real world experience. There's a lot of practical application to things. And I think in a lot of areas outside of communication where it's not so experiential, students don't always know why they're supposed to be doing the work. Where here it's like an immediate feedback. Like you walk out of like, you know, visual media literacy and into a photography course or into graphic design or into television production or video production or advertising, and you're making those things and you go, oh, that's where that theory lands. And so that to me is everything, because it's where you get that practical application. Right, and without that, I think what happens is it delays students' ability to really understand what they're learning, and then like turning that from information into knowledge, right? Because that's that difference. Like information is just knowing what the thing is. Knowledge is knowing how to use it. And so that practical application you're talking about, and like the fact that we have so much of it, is a really big strength in terms of like getting students to really like mold that information into knowledge.
And one of those classes where they can apply that knowledge that they learned is community media. They go out into the city and produce content for local nonprofits. Do you think that since Worcester State is so local to Worcester, that the school itself has a duty to like provide services to like the community?
Yeah, I mean, I don't like thinking things in terms of like has the duty to do it so much as like our students largely are from the area. And so it's more one of those things where like, I mean, I guess you could use the word duty, but I think it's more of like there's an immediate pride to that, right? It's like, so like I grew up in Worcester County. I didn't grow up in Worcester specifically, but but I spent most of my time in Worcester, especially in high school and like all through college. And so like there's an immediate you take pride in your hometown. You take pride in like, you know, your like local area. You know, it's like somebody comes from out of the area and like talks crap about Worcester, like you're gonna get defensive, right? And so I think that like what like the Center for Community Media does is a really important mission. I don't, I guess we could say it's duty bound, but I'd like to think of it more as like, it's here and it's doing what it's doing because there's a deep love for like our own community. It's like, if I can go out and help a local nonprofit here, that just makes like my city better. It makes my community better. It makes like the Worcester County better. And because I live here, that's going to help me. And like because the students coming in are getting out and understanding the city better, it means that they're going to, like students who aren't from Worcester, or maybe from Boston, may decide to stay here after seeing all the things that are available here. So it's that kind. It's in one hand, it's the reason. I guess this is the reason I don't like saying duty is, believe it or not, it's a little bit selfish for the university to have the Center for Community Media. Because what we're doing is like, if you're not from Worcester and you're involved in this, well, like we might entice you to stay in the area, right? And that just makes Worcester, that's good for Worcester. And it's also good for the university. So it's like, because like now you graduate and you stick around and then you have kids, and if your kids did choose Worcester State, right? It's like, in a weird way, it's just kind of like everything is, gets better. And it provides us the ability to make really good content and get our students out into the real world, doing real world things and not just sitting in the hypothetical. Going outside of like, don't get me wrong, I love creative like projects that students make that have nothing to do with like the outside world. There's a place for that. But having students go out into the real world and seeing how things actually impact a community and what they can do, because we feel most of the time like everything's happening to us. It's not often that we say, hey, I can go out and do this thing and it'll somehow help somebody else like out, right? Even if that's just making a video to bring awareness or helping them with a social, that they can then use in a social media campaign or, whatever that is, like that gives our students agency to feel like they can make change. They can have an effect as opposed to like just being very insular. And this is one of those differences between Worcester State and like some of the private schools is like everybody comes in from out of town, they come in from other states. And then they don't really feel like, they don't really leave campus. They don't really like go out into Worcester much unless it's to like for dinner or something like that, right? And then they leave and after 4 years and they're just like, all right, I went to college in Worcester, and then they're gone and they never come back and they never really understood where they were. Where like, the Center for Community Media actually in a weird way, while helping the outside, also like teaches, like gets our students involved in the city. So in a weird way, I'd say it's like, we're also taking as much from the city in a good way, right? And in the end, it ends up working out really well.
Mm-hmm. Very recently, the department was given a grant, and we've been fortunate enough to see it being used to update our equipment. What do you think that new equipment means for like the future of the department and for students?
Yeah, so we've gotten really lucky in the last year. And I say lucky, but there's a lot of hard work that went into it. So first we got the grant through the Success Funds. So last year we were able to buy $82,000 worth of new equipment, and that allowed us to update. So one of the downsides to being a state school is often that like funds are limited in terms of like what we can get, how often we can upgrade equipment and all of those things. And unfortunately, our equipment had started stagnating. And it was about 10, 11 years old in some cases for cameras, which means they were very outdated. And so last year we got the $82,000 grant. We were able to start updating our photography equipment and our video equipment and just replacing some of the old stuff. We're also able to start we're starting to invest into different forms of equipment. So we were able to buy some cinematography equipment so that we could begin offering courses in like more filmmaking, and whether that's documentary or narrative. We started buying a little bit of audio equipment. And this year we just were told we received a $184,000 grant to continue buying equipment. So for our department, this is, in a lot of ways, it's going to change how we teach, what we can offer. So it's going to make it so that we can continue to grow in a way that's in line with more contemporary forms of like media production. Like right now, we're seeing growth in like Massachusetts in the film industry. We're seeing like our students are asking for sports production, like sports media style production, like sports broadcasting. And so with all the equipment we're buying, it's allowing us to start like a podcasting course and a sports broadcasting class. It's allowing us to start offering filmmaking courses on a regular basis and not having to rely on students buying their own equipment to do that. So students have done those things, but a lot of times it's been on the student to have to go buy like enough equipment, like lights, and buy like, if they want to do any kind of follow focus or handheld like steady rig camera stuff, they had to own that stuff. which is very cost prohibitive. With all the equipment we're buying, it's allowing us to start offering that in a more equitable way where like you don't have to, and this was always my big problem as a student when I had to buy all my own photo equipment to try to become a photographer was, it was like, all right, what camera can I scrape together? I had one camera body with one lens, and then I was spending like all of my money on film and paper, right? When I finally bought a digital camera, I remember like $1,000 feeling like, it was like, oh my God, how am I ever, am I ever gonna pay this off? This is a dumb decision to buy this camera. Now we're gonna have, students will be able to borrow, Canon R5s, which, are $5,000, each. So when we have an advanced student, we don't have to say, hey, go buy the best camera you can put yourself into debt for. We can say, safely, it's like, you can borrow ours. So that's going to have a really dramatic effect on also letting students use professional grade equipment, so rather than just having to use lower consumer grade, they can use professional grade equipment, which will prepare students for actually going into the field when they leave here. Students will be able to say, I've worked on that equipment. I've already at least experienced something equivalent to it, if not that. That'll make getting a job easier because it's one thing to have a resume that says like, okay, I've done these things. It's another thing when you show up on set somewhere and say, oh yeah, I can definitely I can jump on that piece of equipment and run that. I know what you're asking me to do when you say like, strike those lights and set everything up. So that's going to be the kind of impact it has.
It's been great hearing about how much the department has done and how it will continue to shape students' experiences here at Worcester State. That wraps up our conversation. Eric, thanks so much for taking the time to talk. I'm Bromley, and thanks for watching The Beat.
Thank you.